100 Facts About the British Empire to Fall Asleep To. Welcome to a journey through time, where we'll explore the story of the British Empire, from its humble beginnings on a small island to its reach across the globe. Let your mind wander as we travel back centuries, to a time when the world was still largely unmapped, and Britain was just beginning to look beyond its shores. Our story begins not with grand conquests or dramatic battles, but with something far quieter: the sea. In the early 1600s, Britain was a modest kingdom, dwarfed by the Spanish and Portuguese empires that already stretched across the Americas and into Asia. But Britain had something special: a long, irregular coastline that created natural harbors and a population that had learned to navigate the unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic. This maritime culture would become the foundation of everything that followed. The first permanent English colony in the Americas was established in 1607, at a place called Jamestown in what is now Virginia. It wasn't glamorous. The settlers struggled through harsh winters, disease, and conflict. Many didn't survive those first years. But Jamestown endured, and it marked the beginning of England's colonial presence in North America, a presence that would grow, slowly at first, then with increasing momentum. Around the same time, English merchants were looking eastward. The East India Company, founded in 1600, was granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I to trade with the East Indies. Initially, it was simply a trading company, seeking spices, silk, and other exotic goods. The company's first voyage reached Indonesia, where they established trading posts. At this stage, there was no grand imperial plan, just merchants seeking profit in distant lands. Yet this commercial venture would eventually transform into something far larger, becoming the vehicle through which Britain would come to control the entire Indian subcontinent. The relationship between trade and empire was never straightforward. In those early decades of the 1600s, English sailors and merchants competed fiercely with the Dutch, who dominated much of the spice trade in Southeast Asia. The English couldn't match Dutch power in that region, so they gradually shifted their focus to India, where Mughal emperors ruled over a vast and wealthy empire. The English established their first trading post on Indian soil at Surat in 1612, after naval commander Thomas Best defeated a Portuguese fleet, impressing the Mughal authorities enough to grant trading rights. These early footholds were precarious. The English were not conquerors at this point; they were supplicants, requesting permission to trade from far more powerful local rulers. In India, the Mughal Empire was at its height, wealthy and sophisticated. In North America, English colonists depended on trade and sometimes cooperation with indigenous peoples to survive. The idea of a British Empire spanning continents was still generations away from becoming reality. Yet even in these modest beginnings, we can see the patterns that would define the empire's expansion. Trade came first, establishing economic ties and footholds in distant lands. Ships carried not just goods but also people, settlers, soldiers, and adventurers seeking fortune or escape from the constraints of life in Britain. And crucially, the English crown granted charters and monopolies to private companies, allowing merchants to act with royal authority far from home. This blend of private enterprise and state power would become a hallmark of British imperialism. By the mid-1600s, England had established colonies in the Caribbean as well. Barbados, claimed in 1625, became one of the most profitable colonies due to sugar cultivation. The small island would soon be transformed by plantation agriculture, a system that would bring immense wealth to British merchants and devastating consequences to the enslaved Africans forced to work the fields. The sugar trade created its own dark geography, a triangle connecting Britain, West Africa, and the Americas, where manufactured goods, enslaved people, and raw materials flowed in a cycle of exploitation. The English Civil War of the 1640s briefly disrupted colonial expansion as the nation turned inward, consumed by conflict between Parliament and the Crown. But even during this tumultuous period, the colonies continued to develop. When Oliver Cromwell came to power, he took an aggressive stance toward expanding English influence, particularly in the Caribbean. In 1655, English forces captured Jamaica from the Spanish, adding another valuable island to the growing colonial portfolio. Jamaica would become Britain's largest Caribbean colony, its economy built on sugar and slavery. By 1660, when the monarchy was restored under Charles II, England had established a string of colonies from the Caribbean through North America, trading posts in India, and commercial interests across the Atlantic world. The pieces were falling into place. What had begun as tentative trading ventures and struggling settlements was hardening into something more permanent, a network of overseas possessions that would, over the next century, expand into the largest empire the world had ever known. But for now, as the 17th century progressed, the empire was still in its infancy, a collection of distant outposts, each with its own character, challenges, and possibilities. The story was just beginning, and the world was about to change in ways that few could have imagined. And so we close this first chapter of our journey, with Britain standing at the threshold of empire, ships sailing toward horizons that held both promise and shadow. As we move deeper into the story, we find ourselves in the late 1600s and early 1700s, an age of rivalry between European powers. The seas had become highways of ambition, and Britain was not alone in its quest for wealth and influence. France, Spain, the Dutch Republic all competed for control of trade routes, colonies, and the riches they promised. The rivalry with France would prove particularly defining. Throughout the 18th century, Britain and France fought a series of wars that spanned continents, conflicts that began in Europe but echoed across North America, the Caribbean, India, and beyond. These weren't just territorial disputes, they were struggles for commercial dominance and imperial supremacy. Each war reshaped the map, transferring colonies from one power to another like pieces on an enormous chessboard. One of the most significant of these conflicts was the 7 Years' War, which lasted from 1756 to 1763. Though it's sometimes called the French and Indian War in North America, this was truly a global conflict, perhaps the First World War. British and French forces clashed in the forests of North America, on the plains of India, in the Caribbean islands, and on the high seas. When the smoke cleared and the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1763, Britain had emerged triumphant, gaining vast new territories. From France, Britain acquired Canada and all French territory east of the Mississippi River in North America. These weren't empty lands, they were home to French settlers, indigenous nations, and complex networks of trade and alliance. The conquest of Canada brought both opportunity and challenge, as Britain now had to govern a predominantly French-speaking Catholic population, very different from the Protestant English settlers to the south. The Quebec Act of 1774 would later attempt to address this by allowing French civil law and religious freedom, though this concession would anger the British American colonists, contributing to their growing discontent. In India, the 7 Years' War had a parallel struggle. The East India Company, which had begun as a simple trading enterprise, had gradually become a military and political power. Company forces, led by Robert Clive, defeated the Nawab of Bengal and his French allies at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This victory was achieved partly through superior tactics and partly through bribery and political maneuvering. Plassey marked a turning point. After this, the East India Company began to transform from a commercial operation into a territorial power, collecting taxes and administering justice over millions of Indians. The aftermath of Plassey brought wealth on an almost unimaginable scale. Bengal was one of the richest regions in the world, famous for its textiles, rice, and other goods. The East India Company now controlled the revenue of this prosperous province. Company officials and soldiers returned to Britain with enormous fortunes, becoming known as nabobs, a corruption of the Indian word nawab. These newly wealthy men bought estates, entered parliament, and displayed their riches in ways that both dazzled and scandalized British society. But this wealth came at a terrible cost. Company rule in Bengal was often corrupt and exploitative. Traditional systems of governance were disrupted, and the company's primary interest was extracting maximum revenue. Between 1769 and 1773, a devastating famine struck Bengal, killing an estimated 10 million people, roughly a third of the region's population. The company's policies, including continuing to collect high taxes during crop failures, exacerbated the disaster. This famine raised uncomfortable questions in Britain about the nature of company rule and the responsibilities of imperial power. Meanwhile, Britain's American colonies were flourishing and expanding. By the 1770s, the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast had grown prosperous through trade, agriculture, and increasingly, manufacturing. The population had swelled to over 2 million people, mostly of European descent but also including hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. These colonies had developed their own political traditions and a strong sense of self-governance through their colonial assemblies. The costs of the 7 Years' War had left Britain deeply in debt, and Parliament decided that the American colonies should help pay for their own defense. A series of taxes and regulations followed: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, each one sparking greater colonial resistance. The colonists argued that they had no representation in Parliament and therefore couldn't be taxed by it. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry, a principle that would escalate tensions toward rebellion. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies and cutting out colonial merchants. In response, colonists in Boston, some disguised as Mohawk Indians, boarded company ships and dumped 342 chests of tea into the harbor. This Boston Tea Party was an act of defiance that linked the growing American resistance to concerns about company power. The same company that was enriching itself in India was now threatening colonial commerce in America. The British government responded with the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts, which closed Boston Harbor and reduced Massachusetts' self-governance. Rather than forcing submission, these measures pushed the colonies toward unity. In 1774, representatives from 12 colonies met at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia to coordinate resistance. The empire, so recently triumphant after the 7 Years' War, now faced rebellion at the heart of its most valuable possessions. The irony wasn't lost on observers at the time. Britain had just won an enormous empire, securing dominance in North America and India, yet within little more than a decade, that very success was beginning to unravel. The costs of empire, financial, political, and moral, were becoming apparent, and the colonists who had helped Britain defeat France were now demanding their freedom from British rule. And so our story reaches a moment of crisis, where the vast empire Britain had built through war and commerce faced its first great challenge from within. The years ahead would test whether this empire could hold together or whether the forces of independence and self-determination would reshape the world once more. The spring of 1775 brought the clash that had been building for years. On April 19, British troops marched from Boston to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts. At Lexington Green, they encountered colonial militia, farmers and tradesmen who had grabbed their muskets and assembled to defend their community. Shots were fired, and 8 colonists lay dead. The American Revolutionary War had begun, and with it, the first great fracture in Britain's imperial story. The war that followed would last 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. And it was far more complex than a simple struggle between colonists and the British Crown. It was also a civil war, dividing families and communities between those who supported independence, the Patriots, and those who remained loyal to Britain, the Loyalists. Roughly a third of colonists actively supported independence, a third remained loyal, and a third tried to stay neutral, hoping to survive the storm without choosing sides. Britain faced enormous challenges in fighting this war. The theater of conflict was 3,000 miles across the Atlantic, making supply lines long and vulnerable. British forces had to subdue a vast territory, much larger than Britain itself, and hold it against a population that was often hostile. The colonists, meanwhile, could wage a defensive war, striking at British forces and then melting back into the countryside they knew intimately. France, still smarting from its defeat in the 7 Years' War, saw an opportunity for revenge. In 1778, France formally allied with the American rebels, providing money, weapons, and eventually troops and naval support. This transformed the conflict from a colonial rebellion into an international war. Spain and the Dutch Republic also entered the war against Britain, stretching British forces thin as they had to defend possessions in the Caribbean, Gibraltar, and elsewhere. The decisive moment came at Yorktown, Virginia, in October 1781. American forces under General George Washington, joined by French troops under the Comte de Rochambeau, laid siege to British General Cornwallis's army. A French fleet controlled the nearby waters, preventing British naval evacuation or reinforcement. After a siege of 3 weeks, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army of over 7,000 men. Though fighting continued sporadically, Yorktown effectively ended Britain's hope of defeating the rebellion. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 formally recognized American independence. Britain ceded not just the 13 colonies but also the vast territory between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. It was a humiliating defeat, the loss of what had been considered the most valuable part of the empire. Yet even in defeat, Britain retained significant possessions, Canada, Caribbean islands, and its growing dominion in India. The empire hadn't ended, it had simply taken on a new shape. The loss of America forced a fundamental rethinking of imperial policy. What had gone wrong? Some argued that the colonists had been given too much freedom, too much self-governance. Others contended the opposite, that heavy-handed control and taxation without representation had driven them to rebellion. These debates would influence how Britain governed its remaining colonies, particularly the diverse territories it continued to acquire in the years ahead. One immediate consequence was the fate of the Loyalists, the colonists who had remained faithful to the crown. After independence, many faced persecution, property confiscation, and violence. Approximately 60,000 Loyalists fled, many to Canada, particularly to Nova Scotia and what would become New Brunswick. This Loyalist migration significantly increased British North America's English-speaking population and reinforced Canada's character as a distinct society from the United States, more conservative and more closely tied to British institutions. While Britain was losing its American colonies, the empire was simultaneously expanding elsewhere. In 1770, Captain James Cook had claimed the eastern coast of Australia for Britain, landing at Botany Bay. For years, Britain had transported convicted criminals to America, using them as labor in the colonies. With that option now closed, the government looked for a new destination for convicts. Australia, remote and seemingly empty, though in reality home to hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples, appeared ideal for this purpose. In January 1788, the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove with over 1,000 people, including more than 700 convicts. This was the beginning of European settlement in Australia, though it would be misleading to call it a colony in the traditional sense. It was, initially, a vast prison. The early years were desperately hard. The settlers struggled to grow crops in unfamiliar soil and climate, facing starvation until supply ships arrived. Yet gradually, the settlement took root, and free settlers began to arrive, attracted by land grants and the promise of a fresh start in a new world. The pattern was familiar, Britain claiming distant territories, sending its people there, and gradually building the infrastructure of colonial control. But each new possession brought unique challenges and required adaptation. Australia's indigenous peoples, who had lived on the continent for more than 60,000 years, would face devastation as European settlement expanded. Diseases to which they had no immunity, violent conflict, and displacement from their lands would reduce their population catastrophically over the coming decades. And so we see how the empire transformed through crisis, losing one empire in America while beginning to build another in Australia, learning harsh lessons about governance while continuing to expand across the globe. The story continues to unfold, carrying us forward through time. As the 18th century drew to a close and the 19th began, Britain was changing in profound ways. Two great movements were gathering force, one moral, one technological, and together they would reshape not only Britain but the entire empire and the world beyond. The first was the movement to abolish slavery. For generations, the slave trade had been a cornerstone of imperial wealth. British ships had transported over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, one of history's greatest crimes. These human beings were torn from their homes, packed into ships in conditions of unspeakable horror, and sold into lifetimes of forced labor on Caribbean and American plantations. The sugar, tobacco, and cotton they produced enriched British merchants and sweetened British tea, all built on a foundation of suffering. But by the late 1700s, voices of opposition were growing louder. Religious groups, particularly the Quakers, had long condemned slavery as incompatible with Christian faith. They were joined by former slaves like Olaudah Equiano, whose autobiography, published in 1789, gave British readers a powerful first-hand account of the slave trade's brutality. Equiano's book became a bestseller, opening eyes to the reality of the system that many preferred not to examine too closely. William Wilberforce, a member of Parliament and evangelical Christian, became the parliamentary leader of the abolitionist cause. Year after year, beginning in 1789, he introduced bills to abolish the slave trade, and year after year they were defeated. Powerful interests, wealthy plantation owners, merchants, shipbuilders, fought to preserve the system that had made them rich. They argued that abolition would destroy the economy, that enslaved people were better off than African peasants, that Britain would lose out to other nations if it abandoned the trade. But the abolitionists persisted, organizing petitions, publishing pamphlets, and holding public meetings. They created what was perhaps Britain's first mass political campaign, engaging ordinary people in a moral cause. In 1807, after nearly 2 decades of struggle, Parliament finally passed the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal for British ships to transport enslaved people. This didn't free anyone already enslaved, but it was a crucial first step. The fight continued for another generation. In 1833, the Slavery Abolition Act passed, declaring that slavery would be abolished throughout most of the British Empire beginning in 1834. Approximately 800,000 enslaved people in the Caribbean and other British territories would gain their freedom. However, there was a bitter compromise. Plantation owners were compensated for the loss of their property to the tune of £20 million, an enormous sum equivalent to roughly 40% of the government's annual expenditure. Meanwhile, the formerly enslaved received nothing, and many were forced into systems of apprenticeship that kept them bound to their former owners for several more years. While this moral revolution unfolded, another transformation was reshaping Britain itself, the Industrial Revolution. Beginning in the late 1700s, a cascade of technological innovations changed how goods were produced. The spinning jenny, the water frame, and the power loom revolutionized textile manufacturing. James Watt's improvements to the steam engine provided a new source of power that didn't depend on water or wind. Factories rose in the Midlands and north of England, drawing workers from the countryside to new industrial cities. Britain became the world's first industrial nation, and this gave the empire new character and new power. British factories needed raw materials, cotton from India and Egypt, wool from Australia, timber from Canada, and they produced manufactured goods that could be sold around the world. the empire became an economic system linking producers of raw materials with industrial centers and global markets, all connected by British ships and British capital. The Industrial Revolution also gave Britain an overwhelming military advantage. Iron and steel production meant better weapons. Steam power revolutionized naval warfare. Steamships could move regardless of wind conditions, making British naval supremacy even more decisive. By the 1830s and 1840s, Britain possessed industrial capabilities far beyond any rival, a dominance that would persist for decades and enable further imperial expansion. India remained central to British imperial ambitions. The East India Company continued to expand its control, using Indian soldiers, called sepoys, to fight its wars. By the 1840s, the company controlled most of the Indian subcontinent, either directly or through alliances with Indian princes who accepted British authority. The company's administration brought some modernization, railways, telegraph lines, a postal system, but it also disrupted traditional economies and societies in ways that created deep resentment. Meanwhile, Britain was extending its reach into other parts of Asia. In 1819, Sir Stamford Raffles established a trading post at Singapore, recognizing its strategic position at the tip of the Malay Peninsula. Singapore quickly grew into a vital commercial hub, connecting trade between China, India, and the wider world. Its harbor welcomed ships from dozens of nations, and it became one of the jewels of the British Empire in Southeast Asia, a cosmopolitan city built on commerce and migration. And so we witnessed the empire at a crossroads, grappling with the moral weight of slavery while surging forward on the power of industrial innovation. These parallel transformations, one seeking justice, one seeking progress, would define the next chapter of imperial history, as Britain wielded unprecedented power across an ever-expanding world. In 1837, an 18-year-old woman became Queen of the United Kingdom. Victoria would reign for 63 years, until 1901, and her name would become synonymous with an entire era, the Victorian Age. During her long reign, the British Empire would reach its greatest extent, covering nearly a quarter of the world's land surface and ruling over roughly 400 million people, about a quarter of humanity. This was the age when the phrase "the empire on which the sun never sets" became a proud boast. From Canada in the west to Australia in the east, from India to Africa to islands scattered across every ocean, British territory encircled the globe. At any given moment, somewhere in the empire, the sun was shining on the Union Jack. It was a statement of pride, but also of the sheer, almost unimaginable scale of British power during this period. Yet this expansion was never inevitable or peaceful. It was achieved through a combination of diplomacy, commerce, and often brutal military force. One of the most troubling episodes of this era was the Opium Wars with China, conflicts that revealed the darker side of British imperial ambition and the willingness to wage war to protect profitable trade. British merchants had long desired access to Chinese markets, but China's Qing dynasty strictly controlled foreign trade and had little interest in British manufactured goods. However, there was one product Chinese consumers would buy: opium, grown in British-controlled India. The East India Company and private British traders flooded China with opium, creating a massive addiction crisis and draining Chinese silver reserves. When the Chinese government tried to stop this destructive trade, Britain went to war. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842, and China's outdated military was no match for British naval power and modern weapons. The Treaty of Nanking that ended the war forced China to pay a huge indemnity, cede Hong Kong Island to Britain, and open 5 ports to British trade. Hong Kong would remain a British colony for over 150 years, until 1997, becoming one of the world's great financial centers. The war was widely criticized even in Britain, with some calling it unjust and dishonorable, but the government defended it as necessary to protect British commercial interests. A second Opium War followed from 1856 to 1860, with Britain and France fighting together against China. This conflict was even more devastating, culminating in the burning of the Old Summer Palace in Beijing, a vast complex of gardens and buildings containing priceless cultural treasures. The treaties that followed opened even more Chinese ports to foreign trade and legalized the opium trade that had caused such destruction. These wars humiliated China and would be remembered as the beginning of the century of humiliation, shaping Chinese attitudes toward the West for generations. Back in India, tensions between the East India Company and the people it ruled were reaching a breaking point. In 1857, a great rebellion erupted, beginning with sepoys in the company's army but quickly spreading across northern and central India. The immediate spark was a rumor that new rifle cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. But the underlying causes ran much deeper: resentment of company policies, economic disruption, cultural insensitivity, and the steady erosion of traditional authority. The rebellion, called the Indian Mutiny by the British in the First War of Independence by many Indians, was fierce and bloody. Rebels killed British officers and civilians, and British forces responded with terrible reprisals. After more than a year of fighting, the British regained control, but at an enormous cost. Tens of thousands died, cities were destroyed, and the trust between rulers and ruled was shattered beyond repair. The most significant consequence was the end of East India Company rule. In 1858, the British government assumed direct control of India, which became the centerpiece of the empire. Queen Victoria was proclaimed Empress of India in 1876, a title that reflected India's special status. The British Raj, as this period of direct crown rule came to be known, would govern India until independence in 1947. British administrators, soldiers, and civil servants would shape Indian society, building railways, establishing English language education, and creating legal systems, while also extracting wealth and resources on a massive scale. During this same period, Britain was expanding into Africa, though initially in a limited way. The Cape Colony at the southern tip of Africa had been taken from the Dutch during the Napoleonic Wars in 1806. British settlers arrived, but they were outnumbered by the Dutch-descended Boers who had been there since the 1650s. Tensions over British policies, particularly the abolition of slavery, led many Boers to trek inland in the 1830s, establishing new republics beyond British control and displacing African kingdoms in the process. West Africa also saw British expansion, though of a different character. Britain established colonies in what are now Sierra Leone, the Gambia, Ghana, and Nigeria, often beginning as coastal trading posts and gradually extending control inland. Sierra Leone had a unique origin. It was founded in 1787 as a settlement for freed slaves, including black loyalists who had fought for Britain during the American Revolution and freed slaves from across the empire. Freetown, its capital, became a symbol of Britain's post-abolition identity, though the reality was more complex than the ideal. And so Victoria's empire expanded relentlessly, reaching across continents and seas, bringing development and destruction in equal measure. The height of imperial power was approaching, but with it came the seeds of future challenges that would eventually bring the whole vast structure into question. As the 19th century entered its final decades, European powers turned their attention to Africa with unprecedented intensity. Until the 1880s, European control in Africa had been largely limited to coastal areas and trading posts. The vast interior remained unmapped by Europeans, ruled by diverse African kingdoms, empires, and societies. But this was about to change dramatically in what became known as the Scramble for Africa. In 1884 and 1885, European powers gathered in Berlin for a conference that would decide Africa's fate without a single African representative present. The Berlin Conference established rules for how European nations could claim African territory. Essentially, they needed to establish effective occupation and notify other powers of their claims. Within 2 decades, Nearly the entire continent would be carved up among European empires, with Britain claiming the largest share. British strategy in Africa was influenced by Cecil Rhodes, a businessman and politician who dreamed of a continuous band of British territory running from Cape Town in the south to Cairo in the north. Rhodes made his fortune in the diamond mines of Kimberley, South Africa, and founded the De Beers Company, which came to control 90% of the world's diamond production. He used this wealth to fund British expansion, and Rhodesia, modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia, would bear his name. The pursuit of this Cape to Cairo vision led to conflicts with other African peoples and European powers. In Sudan, British forces sought to control the Nile River Valley. The Battle of Omdurman in 1898 saw British and Egyptian forces, equipped with machine guns and modern rifles, face a Sudanese army fighting with older weapons. The result was a massacre. Over 10,000 Sudanese were killed, while British casualties numbered in the dozens. The technological gap between industrial and non-industrial militaries had never been more starkly demonstrated. Shortly after Omdurman, British and French forces nearly came to war at Fashoda, also in Sudan, where both claimed control. For several tense weeks, it appeared that two great empires might fight over this remote outpost. Ultimately, France backed down, recognizing British dominance in the region. The Fashoda incident marked the limits of the scramble. Even imperial powers had to recognize when confrontation would be too costly. In southern Africa, tensions between Britain and the Boer republics exploded into war in 1899. The Second Boer War, lasting until 1902, was Britain's largest military commitment since the Napoleonic Wars. The Boers, skilled horsemen and marksmen fighting on familiar terrain, initially humiliated British forces with a series of victories. Britain responded by sending hundreds of thousands of troops and adopting harsh measures to break Boer resistance. The British implemented a scorched earth policy, burning Boer farms and herding civilian populations into concentration camps, the first systematic use of such camps in modern warfare. Conditions in these camps were appalling, with inadequate food, shelter, and sanitation. More than 26,000 Boer civilians, mostly women and children, died in the camps from disease and malnutrition. Black Africans were also placed in separate camps, where at least 20,000 died, though the true number may have been much higher. The war shocked the British public when reports of the camps emerged. Emily Hobhouse, a British welfare campaigner, visited the camps and documented the suffering, creating a scandal that forced the government to improve conditions. The war revealed that imperial conquest came with moral costs that many British citizens found disturbing. Britain eventually won the war, incorporating the Boer republics into the British Empire, but the victory felt hollow and raised uncomfortable questions about imperial methods. While Africa was being partitioned, Canada was evolving into something new within the empire. The British North America Act of 1867 had created the Dominion of Canada, uniting several separate colonies into a federation with significant self-governance. This model, granting internal autonomy while maintaining ties to Britain, offered a way to keep white settler colonies within the imperial system without the conflicts that had led to American independence. Australia followed a similar path. The separate Australian colonies had been developing their own democratic institutions throughout the 19th century, and in 1901, they united to form the Commonwealth of Australia. Like Canada, Australia became a dominion with its own parliament and prime minister, though the British monarch remained head of state. New Zealand achieved similar status in 1907. These dominions controlled their own domestic affairs but generally aligned with Britain on foreign policy and defense. The Dominion model worked for white settler colonies, but it created a two-tier empire. People of British descent in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa enjoyed self-governance and were considered partners in the imperial enterprise. Meanwhile, the hundreds of millions of Indians, Africans, and other colonized peoples were ruled without meaningful representation, governed by British officials who saw themselves as bringing civilization to backward peoples. This racial hierarchy was explicit and would become increasingly contentious as the 20th century approached. And so the empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching across every inhabited continent, its red-colored territories dominating world maps. Yet even at this moment of apparent triumph, the contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore. The gap between imperial rhetoric about civilization and the reality of conquest, the tensions between self-governance for some and subjugation for others. The 20th century opened with the empire at its zenith, but within just 14 years, the world would be plunged into a catastrophic conflict that would change everything. The First World War, which began in August 1914, started as a European dispute but quickly became global precisely because of empires like Britain's. When Britain declared war on Germany, the entire empire was automatically at war as well. The scale of imperial participation was staggering. Over 2.5 million men from India volunteered or were recruited to serve, fighting in the trenches of France, the deserts of Mesopotamia, and the mountains of East Africa. Canada sent over 600,000 soldiers, a remarkable contribution from a nation of only 8 million people. Australia and New Zealand together sent more than 400,000 men, many to fight at Gallipoli in Turkey, a disastrous campaign that became a defining moment in both nations' histories. Soldiers from the Caribbean, Africa, and across the empire fought and died for Britain. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 came to symbolize the war's horrific cost. On the first day alone, July 1st, British forces suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including almost 20,000 dead, the bloodiest day in British military history. Among those attacking were the Newfoundland Regiment, which was virtually wiped out at Beaumont Hamel, suffering over 90% casualties. The battle ground on for months, gaining minimal territory at the cost of over 1 million casualties on all sides. Imperial forces also fought in the Middle East, where the Ottoman Empire was allied with Germany. T.E. Lawrence, known as Lawrence of Arabia, helped coordinate Arab revolts against Ottoman rule, promising Arab independence in exchange for their support. British forces under General Allenby captured Jerusalem in December 1917 and eventually Damascus in 1918. But even as Britain encouraged Arab nationalism to weaken the Ottomans, it was making contradictory promises about the region's future. The Balfour Declaration of November 1917 announced British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, while also stating that this shouldn't prejudice the rights of non-Jewish communities there. This declaration, made during wartime for complex diplomatic and strategic reasons, planted seeds of conflict that would grow for the next century. Britain had promised the same land to different groups with incompatible visions for its future. When the war finally ended in November 1918, the human cost was almost incomprehensible. Over 900,000 men from Britain and Ireland had died, and total deaths across the empire exceeded 1 million. The war had destroyed the old European order, toppling empires and redrawing maps. The German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires all collapsed. In the aftermath, the League of Nations was created to prevent future conflicts, and Britain acquired former German and Ottoman territories as mandates, essentially colonies by another name. Britain gained mandates over Palestine, Transjordan, and Iraq in the Middle East, and Tanganyika in East Africa, along with other territories. The British Empire actually reached its largest territorial extent in the early 1920s, covering about 13.7 million square miles, nearly a quarter of the Earth's land area. But this expansion was deceptive. The empire was exhausted financially and morally, and the war had accelerated forces that would ultimately tear it apart. In Ireland, the war's end brought not peace but intensified conflict. Ireland had been part of the United Kingdom since 1801, but nationalist movements had long sought independence. The Easter Rising of 1916, though initially unsuccessful and unpopular, became a catalyst when Britain executed its leaders. By 1919, the Irish Republican Army was fighting a guerrilla war against British forces. The conflict was bitter and brutal, with atrocities committed by both sides. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 partitioned Ireland. 26 counties in the south became the Irish Free State, a self-governing dominion that would eventually become the fully independent Republic of Ireland. 6 counties in the north, with a Protestant majority, remained part of the United Kingdom as Northern Ireland. This partition created a border that has remained controversial and contentious, the source of decades of violence and only recently beginning to find peace. India, which had contributed so much to the war effort, expected meaningful progress towards self-governance as a reward. Instead, Britain extended wartime emergency powers through the Rowlatt Acts of 1919, allowing detention without trial. Protests erupted across India. In Amritsar, Punjab, on April 13, 1919, a peaceful gathering of thousands was trapped in an enclosed space called Jallianwala Bagh. General Reginald Dyer ordered his troops to open fire without warning, continuing for 10 minutes until ammunition ran low. At least 379 people were killed, though the actual number was likely much higher, and over 1,200 were wounded. The Amritsar massacre shocked India and many in Britain. It revealed the violence underlying colonial rule and strengthened the independence movement. A lawyer named Mohandas Gandhi emerged as the leading voice for independence, advocating nonviolent resistance, civil disobedience, boycotts, peaceful protests. His approach would challenge the empire in ways military force never could, turning imperial oppression into moral ammunition for the independence cause. And so the Great War marked a turning point, a moment when the empire's power seemed greatest but when the foundations were already crumbling. The men who fought had seen the world and asked why they couldn't govern themselves. The contradictions between imperial rhetoric and reality had become too stark to ignore, and across the empire, voices for change were growing louder. The years between the two world wars brought economic turmoil and growing challenges to imperial rule. The Great Depression that began in 1929 devastated economies worldwide, and the empire was no exception. Unemployment soared in Britain, reaching over 3 million by 1933. The dominions and colonies, dependent on exporting raw materials, saw prices collapse for their goods, bringing widespread hardship. In this difficult period, the Statute of Westminster was passed in 1931, fundamentally changing the relationship between Britain and the Dominions. This act recognized that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Newfoundland, and the Irish Free State were fully independent nations, equal in status to Britain itself, united only by common allegiance to the Crown. They could now make their own foreign policy decisions and were no longer bound by British laws unless they chose to be. The Empire of White Settlement had effectively transformed into a voluntary commonwealth of nations. Meanwhile, in India, the independence movement was gaining unstoppable momentum. Gandhi's Salt March of 1930 became one of the most iconic acts of civil disobedience in history. British law made it illegal for Indians to collect or sell salt, forcing them to buy heavily taxed British salt. Gandhi and his followers walked 240 miles to the Arabian Sea coast, where Gandhi picked up a handful of salt, deliberately breaking the law. Thousands joined the movement, and tens of thousands were arrested, but the action captured world attention and made the injustice of colonial rule impossible to ignore. The Government of India Act of 1935 granted Indians some degree of self-governance at the provincial level, but it fell far short of the independence that nationalist leaders demanded. Elections were held, and the Indian National Congress won majorities in most provinces, giving Indians their first real experience of democratic governance. Yet ultimate power remained in British hands, and full independence seemed distant. Then came September 1939, and the world plunged into war once more. When Britain declared war on Nazi Germany, it again committed the entire empire to the conflict without consulting colonial populations. India's viceroy declared war on behalf of India's 400 million people without seeking approval from Indian political leaders, an act that crystallized resentment and accelerated demands for independence. The Second World War was even more global than the First, and once again, the empire mobilized on an extraordinary scale. Over 2.5 million Indian soldiers served, making India the largest volunteer army in history. Hundreds of thousands more came from Africa, the Caribbean, and across the empire. They fought in North Africa, Italy, Burma, and the Pacific, playing crucial roles in Allied victory but often receiving less recognition than white troops. The war came to British territory itself in ways the First World War never had. The Blitz saw German bombs fall on London and other cities night after night from 1940 to 1941, killing over 40,000 civilians and destroying homes across the country. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany after France fell in June 1940, sustained by determination, American aid, and the resources of the empire. Winston Churchill's stirring speeches rallied the nation through its darkest hours, promising that Britain would never surrender. In Asia, the war took a devastating turn when Japan entered in December 1941. Japanese forces swept through British colonial territories with shocking speed. Hong Kong fell within weeks. Singapore, long considered an impregnable fortress and the key to British power in Asia, surrendered in February 1942 after just a week of fighting. Over 80,000 British, Indian, and Australian troops became prisoners of war. Churchill called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, and it shattered the myth of Western invincibility in Asian eyes. Burma was conquered by Japan in 1942, cutting off the vital Burma Road that supplied Chinese forces fighting Japan. The war in Burma lasted until 1945 and was fought in some of the most difficult terrain imaginable: dense jungles, mountains, and monsoon rains. British and Indian forces, along with Chinese and American allies, eventually pushed the Japanese back in brutal fighting. The Burma campaign saw over 71,000 British and Commonwealth casualties, with disease killing as many as combat. Perhaps the most tragic episode of the war for the empire occurred in Bengal in 1943. A combination of factors: wartime disruption, natural disasters, poor government policy, and prioritization of military needs, led to a catastrophic famine. Between 2 and 3 million people died of starvation and disease in Bengal while food supplies existed elsewhere. Churchill's government has been criticized for not doing more to prevent or alleviate the famine, prioritizing the war effort over civilian suffering. The Bengal famine remains one of the darkest episodes in British imperial history. When the war finally ended in 1945, Britain was victorious but exhausted. The country had gone into enormous debt, its cities were damaged, its people were weary, and the world had changed irrevocably. The United States and the Soviet Union had emerged as superpowers, dwarfing Britain's capabilities. More importantly, the moral climate had shifted. A war fought against fascism and for freedom made it increasingly difficult to justify denying that same freedom to colonized peoples. The age of empire was drawing to a close. And so the war's end brought not restoration but transformation. The empire that had seemed eternal just decades earlier was about to unravel with surprising speed, as the peoples who had fought for Britain's freedom now demanded their own. The dismantling of the British Empire happened with remarkable rapidity. What had taken centuries to build would be voluntarily relinquished in little more than 2 decades. The process began immediately after the war, driven by both moral pressure and practical necessity. Britain simply could no longer afford to maintain its empire, and the legitimacy of colonial rule had been fatally undermined. India was the first and most significant territory to gain independence. The Indian independence movement, led by Gandhi's Congress Party and Muhammad Ali Jinnah's Muslim League, had grown too powerful to suppress. But the path to freedom was complicated by religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims. Jinnah advocated for a separate Muslim state, fearing Muslim minority status in a Hindu-majority independent India. In August 1947, British India was partitioned into two independent nations, India and Pakistan. The partition was drawn up hurriedly by a British lawyer, Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India before and completed the boundary in just 5 weeks. The line he drew separated communities that had lived together for centuries, cutting through villages, families, and farmland. The result was one of the largest migrations in human history, as millions of Hindus and Sikhs fled to India and millions of Muslims fled to Pakistan. The partition unleashed horrific communal violence. Trains full of refugees arrived at their destinations carrying only corpses. Villages were massacred. Women were abducted and assaulted. Estimates of deaths range from several 100,000 to over 2 million people. Gandhi himself was assassinated in January 1948 by a Hindu extremist who believed he had been too sympathetic to Muslims. The joy of independence was inseparable from the tragedy of partition, a wound that has never fully healed. Burma, now Myanmar, and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, gained independence in 1948, choosing different paths. Burma opted to leave the Commonwealth entirely, becoming a fully independent republic with no ties to Britain. Ceylon remained within the Commonwealth, maintaining symbolic links to the Crown while governing itself. These different choices reflected the diverse relationships colonies had with the empire and their varying visions for the future. In Palestine, Britain faced an impossible situation created by its own contradictory promises. The Mandate territory had become ungovernable, with violence between Jewish and Arab communities and attacks on British forces by both sides. In 1947, exhausted and unable to find a solution, Britain handed the problem to the newly created United Nations and announced it would withdraw. When Britain's mandate ended in May 1948, the State of Israel was immediately proclaimed, followed by war with neighboring Arab states. The conflict Britain helped create continues to this day. The Suez Crisis of 1956 dramatically demonstrated Britain's diminished status. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, which Britain and France had controlled. In response, Britain and France, in secret collusion with Israel, launched military action to retake the canal. The operation was militarily successful but politically disastrous. The United States, furious at not being consulted, refused to support Britain and threatened economic sanctions. Facing American pressure and international condemnation, Britain was forced to withdraw in humiliation. The Suez Crisis marked the definitive end of Britain as a first-rank power. It revealed that Britain could no longer act independently on the world stage without American approval. Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigned in disgrace, and the lesson was clear: the age of British imperial dominance was over. Henceforth, decolonization would accelerate. Africa saw the most rapid decolonization. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to gain independence in 1957, led by Kwame Nkrumah, who had studied in Britain and the United States and returned to lead the independence movement. Ghana's success inspired other African colonies. In 1960 alone, 17 African colonies gained independence, a year that became known as the Year of Africa. Nigeria, Britain's most populous African colony, became independent in 1960. The process wasn't always peaceful. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising from 1952 to 1960 saw violent resistance to British rule, primarily from the Kikuyu people who had been displaced from their lands. The British response was brutal, establishing detention camps where torture and abuse were systematic. Documents that were hidden for decades revealed that the camps held over 150,000 people, and thousands died. Kenya eventually gained independence in 1963, with Jomo Kenyatta, who had been imprisoned by the British, becoming the first president. By 1965, when Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, unilaterally declared independence under white minority rule, the pattern of decolonization was well established, even if this particular case would take another 15 years to resolve fully. Harold Macmillan, Britain's Prime Minister from 1957 to 1963, captured the mood in a famous 1960s speech when he spoke of the wind of change blowing through Africa. The empire was dissolving, transformed into a commonwealth of independent nations. And so, with unexpected swiftness, the vast empire that had colored world maps in red for generations faded away. Not through conquest or catastrophic defeat, but through a combination of exhaustion, moral pressure, and the irresistible force of peoples demanding what Britain itself had always claimed to value: freedom and self-determination.